So what I'm going to do today is talk to you about an idea that I've been researching for about 15 years. And it's something that I talk about in my book, but it's not something that I talk about much. So this is a sort of fresh talk and a fresh idea for me. And it's inspired a little bit by my experiences as a student, as a high school and primary school student in Sydney. And probably once every 2 weeks, one teacher would say, trying to be original, keep it simple, stupid. You would see this KISS acronym thrown about, and I think there's really good reason for that. There's a good reason to keep things simple. I think students try to use big words when they shouldn't, and they think it'll make them look more intelligent, and obviously that's not always the case. In fact, very often research has shown that we judge people who use smaller words to be more intelligent. So what I want to do is talk about the virtues of keeping it simple, stupid, but also about when we should probably put that aside and strive for a little bit more complexity. And this is the idea that I've been pursuing in my research. So just to give you a sense of why this is such an important principle, you probably all know enough about legalese to know that legal language is more complicated than it needs to be. Here's a great demonstration of that. This is a judgment from the Court of Exchequer in 1842, very famous case. I was a law student here for a while and I studied this case. And I remember trying to work out what was going on in the case. So this is the beginning where the judge is trying to explain the facts of the case. I'll just give you a few seconds to read through. If any of you can work out what's going on in the case, there is something about a donkey. There are some nouns in there, which is good. It's a good start, but it's very hard to work out what's going on. Now, had the judge decided to keep it simple, stupid, you could draw this 160 words down to 12, and this is basically the gist. The servant of the defendant negligently struck the donkey of the plaintiff. There's a lot of fluff. So here, great virtue in keeping it simple. Lots of other examples too. In fact, New Zealand is a little bit ahead of Australia and the rest of the world. They have awards called the Right Mark Plain English Awards. And you can see if you go to the website, they've been doing this for about almost 10 years now, and they have terrific examples where they award special prizes to people who have come up with simplifications. So here's a great example. Here's the award to someone who worked at Telecom New Zealand for the best transformed sentence. Here is the original. One of our technicians will enable the DSL port on the DS LAM at our exchange, and we will send you an e-text when ADSL is active on your line. It's very kind of them to let us know, but impossible to work out what's going on. So this very smart person said, well, let's rewrite it. Let's tell them only what they need to know. We'll let you know when stuff is done, is basically what this amounts to, because you don't need to know what those acronyms are. It's not relevant to the situation. That's a lot of what we're trying to do with this push towards plain English. My favorite example, though, as an academic, is this one, that there are things online called nonsense postmodernist generators. And what you do is you tell them roughly what you want to talk about, and this computer-generated machine will give you a long tract of text that makes sense. When you read it, it sounds like someone very smart has written it, but it means absolutely nothing. There's no meaning to it whatsoever. And people have submitted these pieces of text over time to journals to show that the academic process is flawed. In fact, there was this great piece just a couple of months ago on the fact that 120 bogus scientific articles that meant absolutely nothing had been published in peer-reviewed publications from 2008 to 2013. What this basically means is that the very smartest people at the top of their fields had read, probably 3 of them had read each of the 120 papers and said, this is not only good, it's excellent and it deserves to be published. And the reason they were so confused was because what they were reading was so incredibly turgid and hard to process. So there is great virtue in simplifying, so we don't have cases like this happening. Here's the author of this piece actually tried her hand at the same thing. She wrote a bogus paper called On the Exploration of Virtual Machines, and you can see the beginning there. Unified atomic modalities have led to many typical advances, including IPv4 and gigabit switches, with a reference. I don't know what that means, but you can see how with big words we end up being very confused. Now, I want to suggest that sometimes complexity is a very good thing. It's a very useful thing for us as humans as we make our way through the world. And it's a useful tool, an all-purpose tool that signals to us when we need to think a little bit harder, when we need to take a pause and perhaps reconsider what we had first assumed. So what I want to do is show you an example of where this was true. It's a strange example, but I think it illustrates the point very nicely. This is the game show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. You probably recognize it. It's been a big hit all over the world, including in Australia. But these were two of the very best competitors in the US version. So we have Oggy Ogus on the left, who's a neuroscientist, and John Carpenter on the right, who is a tax consultant. And these are the million-dollar questions. And in case you can't see them, Oggy was asked which of these ships was not one of the three taken over by colonists during the Boston Tea Party: the Eleanor, the Dartmouth, the Beaver, or the William. It's a tough question. And then Carpenter was asked which of these US presidents appeared on the TV series Laugh-In: Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Jimmy Carter, or Gerald Ford. And the way they responded to that question is a great illustration of how important it is for us to have access to these cues that tell us whether we're confident about what we're about to do next, whether what we're about to say makes sense. So Ogus, he's actually a writer. He's a fan of florid language. As you can see, he described the experience, and he says this: "My neurohormones whipped from black misery to shining ebullience, saturating my brain in a boiling cauldron of epinephrine and endorphins. I gaped at the azure screen in front of me as the ultimate question coalesced in hot white font." He goes on. He wrote a very long piece about his experience. Now, this is the million-dollar question. So he's already won $500,000. He's a very smart man who's answered 14 questions correctly. This is number 15. And he goes on and on and on in the same vein. Instead of saying, "It was tough, I had a hard time with that question," he goes on and says things like, "I immediately had an intuition." Now, an intuition, as psychologists know, is something that just pops into your head, almost like your own name does. Just as you know your own name intuitively, sometimes the answer to a question is so easy you don't have to think at all. And in fact, most of our mental lives are spent doing this. We go by intuition, we don't think very hard, we coast along at a very comfortable level, and if we have to, we engage this higher level of thinking. And we only do that very rarely. We spend much of the day coasting along. So he talks about how he had an intuition that one of the ships was Dartmouth, and then he goes on and explains more and more about his thoughts, and he realized that perhaps one of them was the odd one out and therefore was the right answer. It was not one of the ships that was overtaken. And then he says, "I blinked. Suddenly I became aware of the wobble of the chair, the murmurs of the audience. Intuition, what are you thinking?" This is a great moment for him, and it's an important moment, and this is the moment that I focus on in my research. It's the moment when you realize that you need to think twice, to be a bit more careful. Now, keeping it simple, stupid is a great idea because simplicity is useful, but sometimes we want to convey to people that they need to think a little harder about what comes next. I'm going to give you some examples of this soon, but it's at those moments, as Ogus says here, when you really need to know. There needs to be some cue that tells you to think a little bit harder about what's going on. Now, for him, that was clear because he struggled with the question, but sometimes you need help from outside in the world around you. He decides that I'll walk away with the money. He decides not to answer the question because he's just not confident. Carpenter has a very different experience. So this is what happens when your intuitions are questioned, and it's useful when you don't know the answer, obviously. Carpenter says, "I'm going to use a lifeline. If you don't know the game show, what happens is you can call someone to give you a hand, to help you out." So what he does is he calls his dad, and he says, his dad says hello. And then Regis Philbin, the show's host, says, "We've got your son John with us. He's doing pretty well. He's won $500,000 and he's going for $1 million. He needs your help to get there." He was actually the first person ever to be in this position, to have reached this point, to answer a question for $1 million. So he says, "Hi, Dad, I don't really need your help. I just wanted to let you know that I'm going to win the $1 million." Because the US president that appeared on Laugh-In is Richard Nixon. That's my final answer. So for Carpenter, the answer was there as sure as his name was there. It was something that just popped into his mind. He knew exactly what the right answer was. There was no need to question that intuition. Now, this is really quite an important idea. This is just one interesting sort of application of it. But I want to suggest that we can inject artificial bursts of complexity or disfluency. We can basically put aside keeping it simple, stupid, when we want people to think harder. We can do what happened to Ogus there. We can make people reconsider whatever they're thinking at first, what their intuition suggests. Now, I study this topic. It's known as disfluency. The idea is that just as with a fluent language, you bubble along being able to speak your first language without any trouble, but the minute you try to speak a new language, you experience disfluency. You have to think a little bit harder, you spend a little bit more time, you have to engage more deeply, and what that ends up doing, as we've shown, is it makes you think more deeply about whatever information is in front of you. And so you basically, if you introduce artificial bursts of complexity, you can get people to think harder. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So fluency is the idea that things are easy to process. And usually when we read text, it's pretty fluent. And we're striving for that in the push towards plain English. Just to show you what I mean by fluency versus disfluency, on the left you can see fluent font. On the right it's a little bit more condensed, so it's therefore more disfluent. It's harder to read. Here's another example. The font on the left is fluent because it's easy to read. The font on the right is more ornate and curly, therefore harder to read. Same here. There are lots of different ways to make text disfluent. Here's another one. Use a bigger word where a smaller one will do. And you can even change the syntax of a sentence. So the cat sat on the mat is easy to read. The mat was sat on by the cat basically means the same thing, but it's harder to process. Now this stuff really matters. It actually shapes how we think about what we're looking at. And I can show you with some examples from my own research. This is a question that is designed to measure your intelligence. And so I will show you the question. This is the question printed in a fluent font. A bat and a ball together cost $1.10 in total. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Now, if you have a basic grasp of mathematics, you can answer this question. What happens to a lot of people is they seize on their intuition, their first response. Your first response, if you're like almost everyone, is, oh, the bat must be $1, the ball must be 10 cents. They add to $1.10. Thanks very much. The answer is 10 cents. But the difference between those numbers, $1 and 10 cents, is 90 cents. It's not $1. So what you have to do is question that intuition. You have to go further, just as Oggy Ogus did when he was playing Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and you need to say, but hang on, it turns out that for that difference to be $1, we need the one to be $1.05 and the other to be 5 cents, because then they still add to $1.10. Therefore, the bat must be $1.05 and the ball must be 5 cents. And here is the same question printed in a disfluent font. So what we did in this experiment was we gave hundreds of people these questions. There were more of them, not just this one. And we asked them to try to answer them correctly. Now, as I've said before, fluency leads you to just go with your intuition. You just glide along and you don't think very hard. So if you're going to be lured into giving the wrong answer, to saying 10 cents, that should be more of a problem when you experience fluency. But when you experience disfluency, that gets you to stop, think a little bit more carefully. And so what we found in this test is that people do much better at these questions when you print them in a hard-to-read font. When you abandon keeping it simple, stupid, just for a minute, just to give people a pause so they think a little bit harder, they question those intuitions. That's true about lots of different questions that work the same way. Here's another one. This is a question about the Bible. How many of each animal did Moses take aboard his ark? And people will jump up and say, 2, I learned that at school, I've known that forever. But there was no Moses and his ark. There was Noah and his ark. And so you get the same thing. How many people commit this error? They jump in thinking they know the answer because they haven't read the question properly, something we're trying to drum into students everywhere. You find that 88% of people say 2 when they get it in the fluent font, but in the disfluent font they think a little bit. They say, hang on, let's think through this. Before I say 2, I've been slowed down by what's going on here. I've been asked to pause by the text. They don't think exactly like that, but that's what happens. They only commit that error 53% of the time. So almost half of them say, hang on, I know you're trying to trick me. It was Noah's Ark. Another example, was Joshua swallowed by a fish or a whale? You now know obviously what's going on. Jonah was swallowed by the whale. Everyone says whale. 47% make that error when it's presented fluently, and 23% when it's presented disfluently. So again, they think more deeply and more carefully when they experience difficulty or disfluency. So there is some virtue in presenting the information in a format that's harder to read. Here are some other examples. This is a study we ran where we had people reading a review of a new MP3 player, and we wanted to see what they made of the information and whether they processed it carefully, whether they actually formed a reasonable assessment of whether this was a good MP3 player or not. What we did was we varied the nature of the review. For half of them, they got a very fluent masthead on top of the review, suggesting this was a publication that was a weekly report on gadgets and gizmos. Here is the disfluent version of that. It's much harder to read. Sort of a techie collection of symbols that ultimately spell the same thing but take a lot longer to read, and they're harder to read. Then we present them with the information. Now we present them with one of 2 versions. We either present them with this gentleman. We had a database of faces. He was rated as the most intelligent looking person in our database. And in a minute you'll see how the range looks. Now he's at the very top end. This is the very bottom end. Now, if you're the kind of person who's just going to pay attention to appearance, you probably won't pay much attention to what the guy on the right has to say. You'll pay more attention to the guy on the left. But as it turns out, if you're going to think deeply and carefully, the way we constructed the review was the guy on the left looks really competent, but he speaks nonsense. He says things like, celebrities love this MP3 player, which is not a really good cue to whether it's going to be a good MP3 player. He says it comes in a whole range of lovely colours, also not a good guide, because they all sort of come in reasonable colours. And if they don't, that's also not a guide to how well it'll perform. In contrast, this guy on the right, he gives wise counsel. He's a smart guy, and he says to you, let me tell you, the three most important things about an MP3 player are battery life, that it's durable, and that it has a capacity to hold lots of songs. And he tells you that it has all of those. Now, if you don't pay attention, you're going to think that the MP3 player is better when the guy on the right is telling you that it's better. If you are paying attention, you read what's actually being said, and then the guy on the right, even though he doesn't look competent, you realize that what he's saying is more useful. And this is what we find is that people, when they see that fluent masthead, remember this was the masthead, when they see the fluent masthead at the top, they basically go with this guy. They just say then it's a better MP3 player when he's telling us about it. In contrast, when they see the disfluent masthead, they're encouraged to pay a bit more attention, and they realize that it's better with the guy on the right who gives wise counsel. So again, we can make people pay more attention, get over their stereotypes, get over the fact that the guy doesn't look very smart by presenting them with the disfluent font. And finally, I want to show you one great application of this. My advisor at grad school was a guy called Danny Oppenheimer, and he wrote this wonderful paper with some of his students. He called it Fortune Favours the Bold and the Italicized, the Effects of Disfluency on Education Outcomes. And the researchers went into a school in Ohio and they presented the students with one of two versions of different books. So they actually went in, it was a big intervention. They had the regular textbooks that half the students used. This was for all sorts of subjects, English, physics, maths. And then they doctored a version and they created a second disfluent version. So they created the same textbook, but it was harder to read, which is such a counterintuitive idea that you would ever present students with a book that was more complex than it needed to be. And yet this is what they did. They had the fluent version on the left. There's Hamlet's to be or not to be soliloquy, and there's the same thing on the right there. And what they found was quite fascinating, that if you gave these students the book that was in a harder to read font, they spent more time reading it, they paid a little more attention, and then when they did tests at the end of the year, they scored on average 16% more, which is staggering, right? I mean, that's the difference between 70 and 86 on an exam. That's no joke. And they scored that across chemistry, physics, maths, English, by presenting the text disfluently rather than maximally fluently. By adding this complexity, people were paying more attention and they did much better at the task. Now, the cost of this intervention is obviously negligible. We talk about education outcomes and how hard it is to get students to perform 1% better. And here we have a very simple intervention that capitalizes on human psychology and the way we think. The fact that we're normally coasting along, and if anyone's coasting along, it's students. If you can give them that little nudge, push them just a little bit harder to pay a bit more attention, they think a little bit more deeply and then end up processing and encoding the information better so that later on when they're asked about it, they know it better and they do better on tests. So the basic idea is that keeping it simple, stupid is great. It's good for legalese. We want to try and remove descriptions of the wagon and the negligent defendant from the law. It's generally a great thing to have and to strive for. Simplicity and clarity is great. But if you add bursts of complexity, artificial complexity, weirdly, people then pay more attention. It's a really useful cue. So the key is brief strategic injections of artificial disfluency will lead people to pay a bit more attention. Thanks very much.